Welcome, everyone. I'm Angelo Robles, and welcome to Family Office TV. And welcome to Vienna, Austria. It's a pleasure to be here in this great city and great country, and having an opportunity to learn, to immerse myself in the culture and amazing people, and the opportunity, which I love because I'm curious to learn from amazing people, specifically in families, family business, and family offices. We have a special treat today. I'm here in this lovely setting with Octavian Pilati, Austrian entrepreneur, deep thinker, critical thinker, and generational family member. Octavian, welcome.
Great to meet you, Angelo.
My pleasure. I've been indirectly connected to Octavian for a while, but it's the first time we had a chance to meet in person, thanks to my trip here. And why don't I start with, you understand the nuances of family business. You've lived it. Crisis happens all the time, every year. And you may have seen it, or your family, for generation after generation. How do families adapt in the face of change and crisis?
Well, as you mentioned, we have seen quite a bit of crisis as a family over the last few hundred years. I had a crisis in my generation, which I had the pleasure of taking care of for the family. And then obviously we had World War II and World War I, which were rather big crises, which we as a family also had to weather. So I guess one thing that puts families apart compared to other organizations, especially when it comes to continuity and to crisis, is that families tend to have a bit of a longer time horizon when they look at things compared to a corporate. So we don't really think in quarterly reports or in 5-year plans. We have we look at 30 years, next generation, 2 generations. So it's sometimes you even look at, okay, there's some families which have a 100-year plan.
I've seen it.
Yeah. So I think that's the main factor which gives families an edge in decision making during crisis. That you have a longer time horizon and you understand that you might take a hard hit now, but in 15 years you will recover and it's fine for you. But if your compensation is based on your yearly or quarterly results that you deliver as a manager, you will take different decisions.
That are very short-sighted. Often, I would say, especially in a public company, sometimes with no skin in the game. The opportunity for the word family and family business, I think, would be very important. And I know my US audience must have had a little bit of a shocker point there, but I hinted at it in terms of, you very casually stated, from our family perspective, a couple of 100 years. We're not quite used to that in the United States. We have several families that could perhaps go back 6 to 7 generations, but that's very good insight. I always talk about, but I think there's a converse to this, Octavian, the greatest threat to the family is the family.
Yes, so I agree with you on that. The greatest threat to the family is the family, but at the same time, the biggest advantage and the secret sauce that the family has is the family as well. So, as you mentioned, the manager doesn't have skin in the game. As a family member, you grow up from year 0 and you're part of it. You feel it is yours already, even though maybe you're not in control or you don't have shares yet or whatever. But still, you grow up with it. You see it. You get educated from the beginning on to take over maybe or to be a part of it. And that is something that gives you a totally different kind of motivation to drive this forward, to be involved, to make the right decisions than if you just come in on a salary and say, okay, yeah, that's my job right now.
100%. My audience is used to me saying the greatest threat to the family is the family. I'm going to have to adapt that now after a 1-second pause to have that sink in, that's the greatest advantage as well. So I know and I'm thinking of actual cases now, a lot of American families may have newer wealth from Silicon Valley, from one of my backyards in Greenwich, Connecticut, hedge funds, financial services. In other words, newer wealth. Let's assume there's the creator, a spouse, and in today's world, less so multiple children, often one.
Yeah.
Therefore, we're now going to talk a little bit about governance. What that family is likely to do, especially if the child is quote unquote underage, we could get into how you define that. Governance is basically kind of what the wealth creator says. We could say that's top down. It is wickedly efficient. It is, in my example, perhaps even effective, but it's not sustainable. Explain perhaps why.
Well, it's no one likes to be forced to do something that they don't really want to do, for example. That goes into governance. So, on top of that, the wealth creator, again, I'm from a very old family, so it's a bit different to our experience. But if you're the wealth creator, often your children grew up while you were creating the wealth, so they didn't grow up with the wealth already being present. So you have a bit of a different dynamic there. Because that growing up with the wealth, that educational piece is often missing. And it can be difficult to catch it up. But particularly starting with Gen 3, I would say, by educating the generation from the beginning on, teaching them to be owners of wealth later on, and to do that effectively and efficiently and in a good manner is probably the best investment you can make for your legacy and your wealth to continue onwards. So every generation will add their own little spice to it, but it will continue. And the issue with the top-down approach, which you mentioned, is that you're trying to force the wealth creator is trying to force his ideals and his idea onto the generations that are going to follow. And I don't like to work with fear, but no one is better equipped to destroy your legacy than your own children, if they want to.
If they want to. And shockingly, sometimes that if they want to, perhaps happens more than you would think. But to me, I'm going to look at that from the wealth creator side. I think that's on me. Was I present? Did I share our purpose as a family? Did I create not just a legal professional coming in, here's a mission statement, here's a constitution, all things I like. But I think the creator and the family, I think even if it's a child, needs to at least be listened to. So how do you, and I think you and one of your business partners, Nick Van Einern, talk a little bit about perhaps before you even get to governance, which is how decisions are made, there needs to be synchronization, communication. Talk a little bit about the importance of doing that correctly.
Well, you can look at it as on a skyscraper. If you try and build a skyscraper in a swamp without having a proper foundation, you might not even be able to finish it before it topples over. It's the same for families. So you can look at legal structures, tax efficient structures, all that kind of stuff. But if the foundation, which is the emotional stability, let's call it, in a family isn't developed and given, this can fall over really easily. You can structure as much as you want. If people are motivated to be a problem, they will be a problem, and they can be a problem no matter what you do. So, as you said, it's on the generation in charge to educate the next generation, or the rising generation. Nowadays, often you have 3 generations or 4 generations present that are still alive. And one of the major components of educating the rising generation is showing them love and appreciation. You can go into psychology and read a lot about childhood development and what a difference it will make if the parents are present in the upbringing or if they're not present in the upbringing. And that is often in rich family or in wealthy families that is being a little ignored, or maybe very often ignored. And this is one of the most important things to build family unity. And going back to our beginning with crisis, if the family unity isn't strong enough and a crisis happens, the family will start to quarrel between themselves on top of the crisis. While if the family unity has a certain amount of strength, people come together, they put aside minor differences and they say, okay, this is the problem we have to tackle, let's go at it, let's solve it.
You bring up a whole bunch of points that I think is important for me to follow up on. I do agree that especially if the family is newer to wealth and there's a wealth creator, but the wealth hasn't been per se completely liquidated yet, the wealth creator is likely incredibly busy being an entrepreneur, but they can't make the excuse of, I have the money and resources, there's always a boarding school, there's always people to help teach the children, all things that are potentially okay and good. I'm not discounting them, but you have a responsibility to your bloodline and effectively for society to not outsource every little thing. The opportunity to help your children, I think your grandchildren, perhaps your great-grandchildren, to learn capacity and have capability that leads to their competency. If they have competency and you help to instill a character, they're likely, no one's going to be perfect, but to make better decisions. Now, I'm not the only one who talks about this here in the United States or where I'm from. People, of course, like Jay Hughes, people like Matt Wesley now with the Lovins Group have mentioned capacity, capability, leading to competency. There's a term that some family offices have as a chief learning officer. I agree with that. My problem is maybe what I mentioned a minute ago, and that is, as the family member, you can't be absolved of your responsibility to be more hands-on.
Yeah. I think it's a vital part of your education to be hands-on. That your dad or your mom, depending on what their responsibilities are in the family office, sometimes takes you along to work so you can shadow them, even at a young age. My dad did that a lot with me. Or you learn investing together with your parents. And it's not, as you mentioned, you have a chief learning officer and it's like, okay, you take care of the children's education, all these things, and I can zone out and do my thing. The connection isn't built between the parents. So back to childhood development, and that's current theory that in particularly the first 3 years is where you build this basic trust with your parents. That's really important for you to later on be able to trust business partners and other and people in your life. Is the main component of that is how much time you spend with your parents in the first 3 years, and especially quality time, loving time, let's call it. And if that is lacking throughout your life and development, it doesn't matter how much incredibly important things you are being taught by someone, you're going to lack capacity, I think as you called it, in emotional topics like being able to trust,
Right.
emotional regulation, all these kind of things, which can lead to you making erratic decisions when you're under stress and pressure. So this emotional part, you can't really outsource that. You need to do that yourself. And if you have children, you're not just a wealth creator or a wealth owner, you are a parent as well. So you have two roles to fill, and you need to find a balance to do so.
And it's not easy. And I know you want to outsource that. And aspects of it you could enhance with outsourced professionals, sure. Absolutely. That would even be encouraged. But you can't absolve yourself of the responsibility of, again, character and, to me, capacity and capability leading to competency from my experiences. And now you're hearing it from someone, my United States audience of hundreds of millions of people in the United States. I wish my audience was quite that big, but I hope one day it is. If Octavian was in the US with his family background, they may, Like, listen to how stark this statement is. Be the oldest family of continuous wealth. So if I had to ask you the one question that I think we're building up to, what you've been taught within your family that has been passed down, sure, investment acumen, be familiar with taxation, be familiar with proper trust and passing on resources, all valuable. And we're going to get to a little bit of that. But what would be the story? What are you told about? I'm almost careful to use the word stewardship and obligation because that may be undue pressure. But what's a lesson that has been passed down that you've been taught?
Well, one of the biggest ones is probably that wealth comes with responsibility. That is something that is firmly in our family tradition. And with that comes things like giving back to the community in some way, being engaged with the community, and that you have a responsibility to the next generation in the upbringing, in their education. You have a responsibility to your employees. People sometimes think, oh, it would be cool to be really wealthy, but they don't want to have responsibility. And I think that's one of the main lessons that we learn in our families. It goes hand in hand.
I'm going to tie that into how we started with crisis. Yeah. So my audience knows that I'm very active in sovereign risk, disaster preparedness. And if they have wealth, they want to preserve that. Wealth more than just financial, but definitely financial is, of course, a part of it. I'm thinking here in Europe, 1620s English Reformation, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, and the rise of Nazi Germany. Those are just off the top of my head 4 examples of major crisis of uprising where, let's be honest, I'm trying to be a little slightly politically correct. These are often times when the masses who are not affluent and there's an uprising, generally they take out. They either just simply take the resources of the super rich or simply they're eliminated. How have you been able, and the family, for hundreds of years to go through all these challenges that Europeans have faced and still not just survive, but thrive?
Well, first of all, Austria has been for a very long time a very stable monarchy. For a very long time. I think you will get into that at some point today as well. And we obviously
Yes.
profited as a family from that too. But still, we did have to deal with substantial wealth losses in all these crises. And one thing that I do hear quite a lot is, and it goes back to what we just said with the responsibility, if you're seen as a wealth owner that treats people fairly and shows the responsibility that comes with owning wealth, you're less of a target than if you're seen as, I'm not sure how to put this into any nicer words, but if you're seen as a rich asshole by the masses. Sorry, but it
You could say it on YouTube, it's okay.
yeah, fine. And so I think that was one big component. And then it's just, if you, and that's not so easy to do nowadays. In my family, we had when it comes to succession and who does what, we had a very simple rule back then. It's like the oldest son was trained to take over the estates. The second oldest son was trained to join the military. And the third oldest son would be sent to the clergy. And then if there were any more sons, they could do whatever they wanted to. Back then, daughters were just strategically married off usually. So that was back in the day. But what it did lead to is that the family had some sort of position and power in the 3 most important parts of society back then, which was church, the government, and the military. So
Yes.
if you did it smartly, whatever the uphill would be, someone in the family would be on the right side at the end. So that's what I think it was. And then of course, strategic asset allocation. We had a lot of land. We did later on, once it got on vogue, we did have a lot of investments in industries, which we all lost because most of Austria's industry was in the Czech Republic, for example.
Right.
So when that became its own country, the shares in the companies, that it all became worthless. But still, our land investments, our land holdings stayed with us. And again, I think if you're not perceived, or if you're perceived as someone that treats people fairly, there's less motivation for others to try and take away your wealth.
And that is the perfect segue. By the way, that was a great answer. And the nuances around the world, and again in the United States, where relatively wealth is newer, utilizing things like connectivity in military and or clergy are things that my audience in the US has probably never heard of. That's an excellent insight to the challenges during those 4 revolutions, kind of that I noted. And that also segues very well, which you hinted at, and I think my audience would be very fascinated by the sort of resources that a family of multi-generational wealth would have. And my audience has heard me talk about this time and time again. Perhaps wealth is created by being more concentrated, especially in today's world in businesses that scale quickly. But to keep the wealth requires a level of diversity. And I'm thinking of land, I'm thinking of gold, and I'm thinking of art. 3 things, maybe not the most exciting, although maybe art is, but that have withstood the test of time. I could probably argue gems, and I could go back to India 4,000 years ago, so let alone a couple of hundred years. I know you need to be discreet on certain things, but what would you say about one or more of those asset classes that I noted? I believe your family does have a history in land.
Yes, that's correct. Well, the thing about land is if you look at it in times of big upheaval, people will want to eat. People need to live somewhere. So those are 2 very big needs that every person wants to have fulfilled. So by having agricultural land, forestry, and real estate, you provide these things. Gold that you mentioned as well is, so in times of big upheaval, there needs to be some sort of monetary system that's running, and back in the days, coins would be minted with gold and stuff. So it's a form to be able to buy and trade things. Mm-hmm. And I mean, you can carry it around a little bit. Obviously, if you have,
you'll be very strong if it's a lot.
Yeah. So
that's how they worked out back in the day. You carry, I don't know, 100 or 200 pounds of gold.
Yeah, that's how they started with the credit letters and everything a long time ago.
Exactly.
Store it and so on and so forth. But still, it's a trading good for you to work. So we lost all our land in World War II because it was confiscated by the Russians, and the only reason the family as refugees managed to survive was because we had gold coins, we had jewelry that we could take along, and my grandmother would use it to buy bread and things like that.
Of course.
Yeah. We got our estates back in 1955 when Austria became a country again after 10 years of occupation. But for those 10 years, the family lived as refugees spread across Austria and Germany with no money. And my granddad, who was, for example, a major in the German army, he wasn't allowed to work because that's something I only found out recently, that in the occupied lands after World War II, officers from a certain rank onwards were prohibited to work afterwards. So you got food stamps.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I didn't know that either for a while. I only found it out recently. So, those those assets that you can carry can play quite an important role.
Okay, that brings up some follow-up questions that I was going to ask, but you actually provided more insight to it. If I were to break down maybe individually each of the four that I noted, land has the advantages that you note. We're human beings. We want to be grounded. Land could grow food. It provides the opportunity for shelter. It helps to support communities. It can't be taken with you. And yes, it could absolutely be taken from you. Very simply and rather bluntly, how could I make this softer? Simply by force. And governments have the ultimate authority. They have effectively a monopoly on violence, and governments do change. Europeans are going to be more familiar with that. We're not quite as familiar with that. Thankfully so in the US, but sometimes it makes us a little lackadaisical. And also our own government could do what we call eminent domain and so-called pay you a fair price, but basically take your property from you. But I was going to mention that when you mentioned it was taken from you, there is an opportunity if you could prove title to one day in the future, maybe that future is 100 years, to potentially get it back, which you did. So those are the advantages and disadvantages. Gold is somewhat more portable, but in vast amounts, it's too heavy. Someone could also simply take that from you, again, rather being direct by force. Art is interesting. It's lighter than gold. It could be even rolled up to a degree. It's more portable, but again, there's natural disasters like fire. There simply is people knowing where you may have it, and I hate to say force, whether government, nefarious forces, or people. I would say gems are easily the most portable. My audience heard me talk about this yesterday here in Austria. In today's value, in one hand, with the right colored diamonds, rubies, emeralds, sapphires, I could literally hold, we did the math on it, about $500 million. It's amazing. So those are four assets that have proven over time. They each provide a different service. The least portable is land. The most portable is gems.
That's true. But then again, in times of crises, what is $5 billion? Or what do you say? 5 billion? 500?
5 billion.
$5 billion.
Sorry. 500 million. So half a billion.
$500 million in gems in your hand is probably not worth that money when it goes really down to survival.
And you want bread.
Yeah, and you want bread. You're going to exchange a diamond for a loaf of bread, and that bread might have just cost you $10 million.